Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. The summer of 2021 felt like a moment of collective exhale across America. After months of pandemic restrictions, people were eager to reconnect with the open road, with nature, with the promise of adventure. For young couples especially, there was something romantic about the idea of leaving behind the chaos of the world and disappearing into the vast landscapes of the American West. Van life had become more than a trend. It had become a symbol of freedom, of simplicity, of two people against the world. Social media platforms overflowed with images of golden sunsets over desert highways, hands held out van windows, of young faces smiling beneath wide-open skies. It was a dream that seemed within reach, a life that looked perfect from the outside. Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie seemed to embody that dream. They were young in love, and determined to document their journey across the country in a white Ford Transit van they had converted into a tiny home on wheels. Gabby, 22 years old with bright eyes and an infectious smile, had dreams of becoming a travel influencer. She posted regularly on Instagram and YouTube, sharing glimpses of their adventures with a growing audience. Brian, 23, was quieter, more reserved, the kind of person who preferred to stay behind the camera rather than in front of it. Together, they painted a picture of a couple chasing sunsets and living authentically, unburdened by the expectations of conventional life. But beneath the carefully curated images and cheerful captions, something darker was unfolding, something that would soon capture the attention of millions and become one of the most haunting and widely discussed cases in recent memory. Gabby Petito was born on March 19, 1999 in Blue Point, New York, a small hamlet on Long Island. She grew up in a close-knit family, the kind where Sunday dinners mattered and everyone showed up for each other. Her parents, Joe Petito and Nicole Schmidt, divorced when Gabby was young, but both remained deeply involved in her life. She had two younger brothers, and those who knew her described her as a natural caretaker, someone who loved fiercely and wanted everyone around her to feel seen and valued. From a young age, Gabby showed a creative spirit. She loved art, photography, and fashion. She had a way of seeing beauty in ordinary moments, of capturing light and emotion in ways that made people stop scrolling. Friends remembered her as bubbly warm, someone who could walk into a room and immediately make it feel brighter. She wasn't perfect. She struggled with anxiety and self-doubt like many young people do, but she was genuine. She wanted to make something of her life, to build something meaningful, to inspire others. Brian Laundrie was born on November 1997 in Northport, Florida. He grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where kids rode bikes and cul-de-sacs and neighbors knew each other's names. His parents, Chris and Roberta Laundrie, were described as private, protective, and deeply devoted to their son. Brian had an older sister, Cassie, who would later become one of the few family members willing to speak publicly about the case. By most accounts, Brian had a relatively normal childhood. He went to school, played outside, kept to himself. Those who knew Brian described as intelligent but intense. He was interested in art, literature, and philosophy. He read books about transcendentalism, about living deliberately, about rejecting materialism. He seemed drawn to the idea of living off the grid, of finding meaning outside the structure society imposed. But there was also something harder to pin down about him, a tendency to withdraw, to brood, to react with sudden flashes of emotion that didn't always match the situation. Gabby and Brian met in high school on Long Island. It's unclear exactly when they started dating, but by 2019, they were in a committed relationship. In photos from those early years, they look happy, young and hopeful, leaning into each other at concerts, laughing on beaches, making goofy faces for the camera. Gabby's family welcomed Brian. He became a regular presence at family gatherings, someone they trusted, someone they believed loved Gabby. In 2019, the couple moved to Northport, Florida, where Brian's parents lived. They moved into the Laundrie family home, a modest single-story house on a quiet street. It wasn't the most conventional arrangement for a young couple, but it made financial sense. Gabby worked various jobs at a juice bar at a local restaurant while dreaming of something bigger. Brian worked odd jobs as well, but his passion seemed to lie elsewhere, in books and ideas rather than steady employment. During this time, Gabby's social media presence began to grow. She started an Instagram account and a YouTube channel under the name Nomadic Static, sharing her aesthetic photography and musings about life and travel. She wasn't a major influencer yet, but she was building something. She had vision. She wanted to inspire other young women to chase their dreams, to explore the world, to believe they create lives that felt authentic and free. The idea for the cross-country road trip seems to have emerged gradually. Gabby and Brian talked about it for months, planning routes, researching national parks, imagining what it would be like to wake up in a different place every few days. In early 2021, they purchased a white 2012 Ford Transit Connect van. It wasn't one of those fully renovated, Instagram perfect van builds. It was modest, functional, just big enough for a bed, some storage, and the essentials. They painted the interior, decorated it with plants and fairy lights, added personal touches that made it feel like home. Gabby's family supported the trip, though her mother Nicole had reservations. She worried about her daughter being on the road for so long, about the strain it might put on the relationship, about the realities of living in such close quarters with another person. But Gabby was excited. She talked about the trip constantly, about the places they would see, the content she would create, the memories they would make. Her family wanted her to be happy, so they encouraged her to go. On July 2, 2021, Gabby and Brian left New York and began driving west. Their plan was loose but ambitious: visit national parks, camp under the stars, document everything. Gabby posted regularly on Instagram, sharing photos of stunning landscapes, quirky roadside attractions, moments of quiet beauty. To the outside world, everything looked perfect. The captions were upbeat. The photos were breathtaking. The comments were full of encouragement and envy. "Living the dream," people wrote. "You two are so cute together. I wish I could do this." But reality, as it often does, told a different story. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Friends and family noticed that Gabby's communication became less frequent as the trip progressed. Phone calls were shorter. Text messages took longer to answer. When asked if everything was okay, Gabby would reassure them that she was fine, just busy, just tired from the road. But there was something in her tone, something strained, that made the people who loved her uneasy. By mid-July, Gabby and Brian were in Utah, one of the most scenic and remote parts of their journey. They visited Salt Lake City, then headed south toward the Moab area, a red rock wonderland of arches, canyons, and vast stretches of desert. It should have been one of the highlights of their trip. Instead, it became the first documented moment when the fayade began to crack. On August 12, 2021, at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, a 911 call was placed in Moab, Utah. The caller, a concerned witness, reported seeing a man hitting a woman near a gas station. The caller described seeing a white van, a young couple arguing, and the man appearing to slap or strike the woman. The dispatcher took the information and relayed it to officers in the area. Within minutes, a Moab City police officer spotted the white Ford Transit van driving erratically on the highway. The officer activated his lights and initiated a traffic stop. The van pulled over. What happened next would be recorded on body camera footage that would later be viewed millions of times. Analyzed frame by frame, discussed endlessly by internet sleuths, mental health professionals, and true crime enthusiasts. When the officer approached the van, he found Gabby in the driver's seat. She was crying, shaking, struggling to catch her breath. Her face was red and streaked with tears. She kept apologizing over and over, saying she was sorry, that she had been fighting with her boyfriend, that she had anxiety, that she had OCD, that sometimes she got really worked up. She was talking fast, barely pausing for breath, her words tumbling out in a rush of emotion. Brian, meanwhile, was calmer. He stood outside the van, hands in his pockets, speaking in measured tones. He told the officers that Gabby had been stressed, that she had been worried about her blog not being good enough, that she had grabbed the steering wheel during an argument, that he had tried to get away from her. He had scratches on his face and arms. When asked about them, He said Gabby had scratched him during the altercation. He didn't seem angry. He seemed tired, almost resigned. The officers separated the couple and interviewed them individually. Gabby continued to cry. She admitted to hitting Brian, to losing her temper, to feeling overwhelmed by everything, the pressure to create content, the constant togetherness. She took full responsibility for the fight. She said Brian hadn't hurt her. She said she was the aggressor. She said she just wanted everything to be okay. The officers were in a difficult position. Utah law required them to take action in domestic violence situations, but the dynamics here were complicated. Gabby presented as the primary aggressor. Brian had visible injuries. There were no signs that Brian had physically harmed Gabby. After consulting with supervisors and reviewing the evidence, the officers made a decision. They would not arrest anyone, but they would separate the couple for the night. Brian would stay in a hotel paid for by the police department. Gabby would stay in the van. The officers believed this would give both of them time to cool down, to reflect, to reset. Before they parted ways, one of the officers spoke to Gabby with genuine concern. He told her that relationships could be toxic, that sometimes people brought out the worst in each other, that it was okay to walk away if things weren't working. Gabby nodded, still crying. Still apologizing. She said she loved Brian. She said they were just stressed. She said they would be fine. The officer let her go. The body camera footage ends with Gabby sitting alone in the van, wiping her tears, trying to compose herself. This moment, this single traffic stop in the desert, would later be dissected endlessly. People would ask why the officers didn't see what now seemed so obvious. They would point to Gabby's distress, to the power dynamics, to the way she blamed herself, to the way Brian remained so calm. Experts in domestic violence would explain that victims often minimize abuse, that they protect their abusers, that they internalize blame. Others would argue that the officers did what they could with the information they had, that hindsight is 20/20, that no one could have predicted what was coming. But in that moment, on that hot August afternoon, Gabby Petito got back in her van and continued on her journey. After the Moab incident, Gabby and Brian reconciled. They continued traveling together through Utah, visiting national parks, taking photos, posting updates. To the outside world, the trip seemed to be back on track. Gabby posted a picture of herself at Delicate Arch in Arches National Park, smiling in the golden light. The caption was cheerful. The comments were full of heart emojis, but behind the scenes, communication with Gailey was becoming more sporadic. Her mother, Nicole, would later say that Gabby's text messages started to feel off, too short, too formal, not like her daughter's usual voice. There were long stretches of silence. When Nicole would text asking where Gabby was, the responses were vague. No service here. No service here. By late August, Gabby and Brian were in the Grand Teton National Park area in Wyoming, one of the most beautiful and remote regions of the American West. The Tetons are a jagged mountain range that rises abruptly from the valley floor, their peaks cutting into the sky like broken teeth. The area is vast, wild, and unforgiving. Cell phone service is limited. There are miles of wilderness where a person could disappear and never be found. On August 20, 2021, Gabby FaceTimed with her mother. It was a brief call, but Nicole would later say that Gabby seemed off, distracted, anxious, not fully present. Gabby said they were leaving Utah and heading to Grand Teton, then on to Yellowstone. She said she would check in soon. That was the last time Nicole Schmidt saw her daughter's face. On August 27, Gabby's mother received a text message from Gabby's phone. The message was strange, stilted, not written in Gabby's usual style. It read, "Can you help Stan? I just keep getting his voicemails and missed calls." Stan was Gabby's grandfather, but Gabby never called him Stan. She called him Grandpa. Nicole immediately felt uneasy. Something was wrong. On August 30, another text arrived from No Service in Yosemite. But this didn't make sense. Gabby and Brian weren't supposed to be in Yosemite. They were supposed to be in Wyoming. Yosemite is in California, hundreds of miles away. Nicole knew in her gut that something was terribly wrong. She tried calling Gabby repeatedly. The calls went to voicemail. She texted. Meanwhile, on September 2021, Brian Laundrie arrived back at his parents' home in Northport, Florida. He was driving Gabby's van. He was alone. He did not report Gabby missing. He did not contact her family. He did not offer any explanation for why he had returned without her. Gabby's family tried desperately to reach Brian and his parents. They called. They texted. They sent messages through mutual friends. The Laundrie family did not respond. The silence was deafening. Days passed. Still no word from Gabby, still no answers from Brian. On September 11, 2021, 10 days after Brian returned, Gabby's family officially reported her missing. Nicole Schmidt filed a missing persons report with the Suffolk County Police Department in New York and the Northport Police Department in Florida. She provided authorities with every detail she could remember. The last time she spoke to Gabby, the route they were supposed to be taking, the text messages that didn't sound right, the fact that Brian had returned alone and refused to speak. The case immediately garnered attention. Gabby's story had all the elements that capture public fascination: a young, photogenic couple, a cross-country road trip documented on social media, a mysterious disappearance, and a boyfriend who refused to talk. News outlets picked up the story. Social media exploded. Amateur sleuths began combing through Gabby's Instagram posts, analyzing every photo, every caption, every comment for clues. The North Police Department attempted to speak with Brian Laundrie. They went to his parents' home. The family, through their attorney, declined to cooperate. Brian exercised his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. His parents did the same. The attorney released a brief statement suggesting that the family hoped for Gabby's safe return, but would not be making any further comments. The silence from the Laundrie household only intensified public scrutiny. People were outraged. How could Brian come home without Gabby and say nothing? How could his parents stand by and watch a young woman's family suffer without offering any information? The FBI became involved. The case was no longer just a missing person investigation. It was a potential crime. On September 13, 2021, authorities released body camera footage from the August 12 Moab police stop. The video went viral. Millions of people watched Gabby crying, watched her blame herself, watched the officers talk to her with kindness, but ultimately let her go. The video sparked fierce debate. Some saw it as proof of domestic violence, evidence that Gabby was being abused and the warning signs were missed. Others saw a complicated situation, two people in a toxic relationship, a system that tried to help but couldn't predict the future. As the investigation intensified, authorities began searching the areas where Gabby and Brian had traveled. They focused on Wyoming, particularly the Grand Teton National Park area, based on the last known communication from Gabby's phone. Search teams conned through campgrounds, trails, and remote areas. Volunteers joined the effort. TikTok users who had been traveling in the same area around the same time began reviewing their footage, looking for any glints of the white van. One such user, a woman named Jen Bethune, had been traveling through the Spread Creek dispersed camping area in Grand Teton around August 27. She reviewed her footage and found something chilling. A brief clip showing a white van parked alone in the distance, partially obscured by trees. The van looked like Gabby's. Bethune contacted the FBI. She provided the footage and the exact coordinates of where she had been when she filmed it. On September 19, 2021, search teams entered the Spread Creek area. It's a remote section of land along the eastern edge of Grand Teton National Park, accessible by rough dirt roads, surrounded by sagebrush and wilderness. The kind of place where people camp to get away from everything, where the silence is absolute and the stars are overwhelming. The search didn't take long. Just a few hundred feet from where the van had been spotted in the video, authorities found a body. It was lying in a grove of trees, partially concealed by the landscape. The body was consistent with Gabby Petitot's description. The Teton County coroner was called to the scene. An autopsy would be required to confirm identity and cause of death, but investigators already knew. They had found Gabby. The news spread instantly. Major news networks broke into regular programming. Social media erupted. Millions of people who had been following the case felt a collective punch to the gut. The hope that had lingered, the possibility that Gabby might still be found alive, was gone. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a homicide. Gabby Petitot's family released a statement thanking everyone who had helped search for her, asking for privacy as they grieved. and pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Her mother's words were raw and heartbreaking. If there is a relationship that might not be the best for you. If you're being abused, get out of it. You never know what could happen next. The focus now turned entirely to Brian Laundrie. Where was he? What had happened in those Wyoming woods? And why, if he had nothing to hide, had he remained silent while the world searched for Gabby? But when authorities went to the Laundrie home to speak with Brian, they were met with a shock. Brian was gone. According to his parents, he had left on September 14, 3 days after Gabby was officially reported missing, telling them he was going to hike in the nearby Carlton Reserve, a massive 25,000-acre wilderness area filled with swamps, dense vegetation, and alligators. He had taken a backpack. He never came home. The Laundries waited several days before reporting their son missing. The delay raised immediate questions and fury from the public. How could they let him leave? Why didn't they report it immediately? Were they helping him escape? Now, law enforcement faced two urgent questions. Where is Brian Laundrie, and what did he do to Gabby Petito? The investigation shifted into high gear. The FBI officially named Brian Laundrie as a person of interest in Gabby's disappearance and death. A federal arrest warrant was issued, but it wasn't for murder. It was for unauthorized use of a debit card. According to the warrant, Brian had used Gabby's Capital One debit card and pen to make unauthorized withdrawals totaling over $1,000 between August 30 and September 1, the period when he was driving back to Florida alone. This charge was strategic. While authorities worked to build a case related to Gabby's death, the debit card charge gave them legal grounds to arrest Brian if he was found. It was a common tactic in cases like this: use whatever charge is available to get the suspect into custody. Then work from there. The search for Brian Laundrie became a national obsession. The Carlton Reserve, where his parents said he had gone hiking, was a hostile environment, swampy, flooded, filled with wildlife. Search teams, including helicopters, drones, K-9 units, and divers, scoured the area day after day. News crews camped outside the Laundrie home, broadcasting live updates. Protesters gathered on the street, holding signs demanding answers, shouting at the family. The public's reaction was visceral and relentless. Brian Laundrie became one of the most hated men in America. People dissected his social media, his quotes, his reading list. They pointed to his interest in books like Fight Club and writings about rejecting societal norms as evidence of a disturbed mind. They analyzed old photos of him and Gabby, looking for signs of control, of anger, of violence. Dog the Bounty Hunter, the reality TV star, even joined the search, claiming to have leads on Brian's whereabouts. And through it all, the Laundrie family remained silent. On September 21, 2021, the Tatum County Coroner's Office held a press conference to release preliminary findings from Gabby Petito's autopsy. Dr. Brent Blue, the county coroner, confirmed what everyone already feared. The body found at Spread Creek was indeed Gabby Petito. The preliminary manner of death was ruled a homicide. Dr. Blue did not release the cause of death at that time, stating that further forensic examination was needed. But the word homicide was enough. This was now officially a murder investigation. The news hit Gabby's family like a second wave of devastation. They had known logically that finding her alive was unlikely after so many days. But hope is a stubborn thing, and hearing the word homicide spoken aloud made it real in a way nothing else had. Gabby hadn't gotten lost. She hadn't wandered off and succumbed to the elements. Someone had killed her, and everyone knew who the prime suspect was. Brian Laundrie had now been missing for a week. The search of the Carlton Reserve continued, but it was yielding nothing. The reserve is a brutal landscape, over 25,000 acres of wetlands, hardwood swamps, and pine flatwoods. Much of it was underwater due to recent flooding. Alligators, venomous snakes, and aggressive wildlife populated the area. If Brian had truly gone into the reserve, searchers said, the conditions were harsh enough that survival would be extremely difficult, especially for someone without extensive wilderness training. But many people didn't believe Brian was in the reserve at all. They believed he had a head start, that he had run, that perhaps his family had helped him escape. The timeline supported this theory. Brian had returned to Florida on September 1. Gabby wasn't reported missing until September 11. That gave him 10 days to disappear before law enforcement even began looking for him. And according to his parents, he had left for his hike on September 14, which meant he had another 3 days before they reported him missing on September 17. The public was furious. Online communities dedicated to the case grew exponentially. Reddit threads with hundreds of thousands of members dissected every detail. People tracked flights leaving Florida in early September, convinced Brian had fled the country. They analyzed security footage from stores near the Laundrie home. They followed tips and rumors, some credible, most not. The case had become a phenomenon unlike anything in recent memory, a real-time mystery playing out across social media, news networks, and in the fevered imaginations of millions. The Northport Police Department and the FBI faced intense scrutiny. Why hadn't they put surveillance on Brian before he disappeared? Why had they allowed him to slip away? Law enforcement officials defended their actions, stating that at the time Brian left for his hike, he was only a person of interest, not a suspect, and they didn't have legal grounds to detain him or monitor his movements. But to the public, it felt like a catastrophic failure. Meanwhile, investigators were working to piece together exactly what had happened in Wyoming. They scoured the Spread Creek area where Gabby's body had been found, collecting evidence, photographing the scene, searching for anything that might tell them what had occurred in those final moments. The location itself was telling. It was remote, off the main roads, the kind of place you'd only find if you were deliberately seeking solitude or trying to hide something. Witnesses began coming forward with information about seeing Gabby and Brian in the days before her death. A couple who had been traveling through Grand Teton around August 27 reported seeing a young man and woman arguing near Spread Creek. The man had been aggressive, they said, yelling, grabbing at the woman. Other travelers reported seeing the white van parked in various locations around the area. Some recalled seeing Brian alone, appearing agitated, walking along the roadside. One particularly chilling account came from a woman named Miranda Baker, who posted a TikTok video describing an encounter she and her boyfriend had with Brian Laundrie on August 29. According to Miranda, they had picked up a hitchhiker near Coulter Bay in Grand Teton. The hitchhiker was a young man with a backpack who said his name was Brian. He claimed he had been camping at a site along Snake River and needed a ride back to his van, which was parked near the Spread Creek dispersed camping area. Miranda said Brian was friendly at first, offering them money for the ride, chatting about camping. But when they mentioned they were heading to Jackson Hole, and he realized they would be driving past Spread Creek, Brian suddenly became agitated. He said he needed to get out immediately. They were still miles from where he claimed his van was parked, but he insisted they pulled over, and Brian got out and walked away into the darkness. Miranda didn't think much of it at the time. Hitchhikers could be odd, and maybe it changed his mind about where he wanted to go. But when she saw Brian's face on the news weeks later, she realized the timeline matched up. August 29 was 2 days after the last confirmed sighting of Gabby alive. Miranda contacted the FBI and provided her account. The significance of this encounter was profound. If Brian was hitchhiking alone on August 29, asking for a ride back to a van near Spread Creek, it suggested that Gabby was already dead by that point. It suggested that Brian had left her body in the woods and was trying to create distance, perhaps to establish an alibi or simply to get away from the scene. The fact that he panicked when he realized the dryness when heading towards Spread Creek added another layer of suspicion. Why would he react that way unless he was hiding something in that exact location? Investigators also obtained records from Gabby's phone and social media accounts. They traced her last known locations, matched them with cell tower data, and confirmed that she had been in the Grand Teton area in late August. The strange text messages sent to her mother on August 27 and August 30 were analyzed. Forensic linguists and investigators believed the messages had not been sent by Gabby. The tone, the phrasing, the uncharacteristic reference to her grandfather as Stan, all of it pointed to someone else using her phone, most likely Brian, trying to buy time or misdirect her family about her location. On October 12, 2021, Dr. Brent Blue held another press conference, this time to release the final autopsy results. The findings were devastating. Gabby Petitot's cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Dr. Blue stated that she had been strangled manually, and that her body had been left in the wilderness for approximately 3 to 4 weeks before being discovered. He estimated that she had died sometime between late August 27 and early August 30. Strangulation is an intensely personal form of violence. It requires sustained physical force, typically several minutes of continuous pressure on the neck. It is not a crime of passion in the sense of a single impulsive act. It requires the killer to maintain their grip, to watch the victim struggle, to feel the life leave their body. The revelation that Gabby had been strangled added a new dimension of horror to the case. This wasn't a sudden fight that escalated tragically. This was deliberate. This was murder. This was murder. Dr. Blue also confirmed that Gabby had not been pregnant, dispelling rumors that had circulated online. He noted that the body had been exposed to the elements and to wildlife activity, which had complicated some aspects of the examination, but the cause of death was clear and conclusive. Gabby's family released another statement, thanking Dr. Blue and the investigators, and renewing their plea for anyone with information to come forward. They also announced the creation of the Gabby Petitot Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping families of missing persons and supporting victims of domestic violence. In their grief, they were trying to create something meaningful, to ensure that Gabby's death might somehow help others. The manner of Gabby's death, strangulation, immediately refocused attention on the Moab incident from August 12. Domestic violence experts weighed in, explaining that strangulation is one of the most significant risk factors for future lethal violence in domestic situations. Studies show that if an abuser has strangled a partner before, the victim's risk of being killed by that partner increases exponentially. While there was no evidence that Brian had strangled Gabby during the Moab altercation, the pattern of conflict, the visible distress Gabby exhibited, and the way she blamed herself all fit textbook patterns of abuse. People rewatched the body camera footage with fresh eyes. They noted how Gabby apologized constantly, how she minimized Brian's actions, how she took responsibility for everything. They noted how Brian remained calm and composed, how he framed himself as the victim, how he had visible scratches but showed no anger or fear. Experts explained that this dynamic, where the victim appears hysterical and the abuser appears rational, is common in domestic violence situations. The victim is often in a heightened state of fear and emotional dysregulation, while the abuser has learned to control their public presentation. One detail from the Moab footage took on new significance. At one point, an officer asked Gabby if Brian had hit her. She said no, but then she made a small gesture touching her face and said something about him grabbing her face during arguments. The officer didn't press further. Now, people wondered what that gesture meant. Had Brian grabbed her by the face or neck before? Was that a warning sign that was missed? Of course, these were questions that could never be fully answered. Gabby was gone. Brian was still missing. And the only two people who knew exactly what happened in those Wyoming woods were no longer able to tell their stories. The search for Brian Laundrie continued through October, but it was becoming increasingly frustrating and surreal. Despite the massive resources being dedicated to finding him, helicopters, drones, K-9 units, dive teams, hundreds of law enforcement personnel, there was no trace of him. The Carlton Reserve search turned up nothing. No campsite, no discarded belongings, no body. Tips poured in from across the country. Brian had been spotted in Alabama, in North Carolina, in Mexico on the Appalachian Trail, at a truck stop in Tennessee. Every lead was investigated. None panned out. The FBI received thousands of tips, the vast majority of which turned out to be mistaken identity or outright fabrications. People were seeing Brian Laundrie everywhere, a phenomenon psychologists explained as a combination of heightened awareness and the brain's tendency to find patterns even where none exist. Dog the Bounty Hunter continued his highly publicized search, claiming to have inside information and hot leads. He searched areas around Fort DeSoto Park, a campground where the Laundrie family had gone camping in early September, shortly after Brian returned from Wyoming. Dog suggested that Brian might have fled from there, possibly by boat. The media followed his every move, though law enforcement largely dismissed his involvement as a publicity stunt. The Laundrie family remained in their home under siege. News vans lined the street. Protesters camped on the lawn. At one point, demonstrators left a billboard truck outside the house, displaying photos of Gabby and messages demanding answers. The family's attorney continued to issue terse statements, saying the family hoped Brian would be found safe, and that they were cooperating with law enforcement. But publicly, it appeared they were sharing little if any useful information. The question on everyone's mind was simple: where is Brian Laundrie? Was he alive, hiding somewhere, surviving on wilderness skills and sheer desperation? Had he committed suicide in the reserve, his body hidden by water and vegetation? Had he escaped the country with help? Or was there another possibility no one had considered? On October 20, 2021, the Laundrie family informed the FBI that they wanted to search the Carlton Reserve themselves. They claimed they knew areas Brian liked to visit within the reserve, places he might have gone that searchers might have missed. This request was met with skepticism and anger from the public. Why now? Why hadn't they shared this information earlier? Were they planting evidence or trying to manipulate the investigation? Nevertheless, law enforcement allowed Chris and Roberta Laundrie to accompany investigators into the reserve. On the morning of October 20, Chris Laundrie led authorities to an area known as the Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park, which borders the Carlton Reserve. It was an area that had been previously underwater due to flooding, but recent dry conditions had caused water levels to drop. Within hours of beginning the search in this area, something was found: a white bag, then a backpack. The items were partially submerged in the muddy terrain, tangled in brush. Nearby, law enforcement discovered what appeared to be human remains, skeletal remains scattered, consistent with a body that had been exposed to water, heat, and wildlife for an extended period. The discovery was unexpected. Many had speculated Brian was dead, but because of how it happened, the fact that Brian's father led them to the area, that remains were found so quickly after weeks of fruitless searching, ignited immediate conspiracy theories. Had the Laundries known where Brian was all along? Had they waited for water levels to drop before discovering the body? Were they trying to control the narrative? The remains and belongings were transported to a forensic anthropologist for examination. On October 21, 2021, the FBI confirmed that the remains were those of Brian Laundrie. He was dead. The massive manhunt was over, but the questions were just beginning. The FBI also confirmed that a notebook had been found near Brian's remains. The notebook was described as possibly salvageable, though it had been exposed to water and would require careful forensic examination. Immediately, people speculated about what might be in the notebook: a confession, an explanation, a suicide note. The FBI stated that the contents of the notebook would be reviewed as part of the ongoing investigation, but did not provide a timeline for when or if that information would be made public. A preliminary examination suggested no foul play in Brian's death. There were no obvious signs of injury to the remains that would indicate violence from another person. The location where he was found was deep in the reserve, in a swampy area that had been underwater for much of the time searchers had been looking. It appeared that Brian had gone into the reserve, as his parents had said, and had not come out. The manner and cause of Brian's death would take longer to determine. Skeletal remains that have been exposed to the elements for weeks don't provide easy answers. But the prevailing theory, even before official confirmation, was suicide. Brian had gone into the wilderness alone, likely knowing that the world was closing in on him, and had ended his own life. On November 23, 2021, the FBI Denver field office released a statement providing an update on the investigation. The statement confirmed that a review of Laundrie's notebook had been completed. According to the FBI, the notebook contained written statements by Brian Laundrie claiming responsibility for Gabby Petito's death. While the exact contents of the notebook were not released to the public, the FBI made it clear Brian had confessed. The statement read in part, "All logical investigative steps have been concluded in this case." The investigation did not identify any other individuals other than Brian Laundrie directly involved in the tragic death of Gabby Petito. The FBI's primary focus throughout the investigation was to bring justice to Gabby and her family. With Brian dead and a confession in hand, the case was effectively closed from a criminal standpoint. There would be no trial, no courtroom confrontation, no opportunity for Gabby's family to face her killer and demand answers. Brian Laundrie had taken his own life, and in doing so, had taken with him the full truth of what happened in those final days. The Teton County coroner later released additional information, indicating that Brian's death was consistent with inflicted gunshot wound. A firearm was found near his remains. The timeline suggested that Brian had likely died in mid to late September, possibly within days or even hours of entering the Carlton Reserve. If true, it meant he had been dead for weeks while the world searched for him, while the media speculated, while millions of people across the globe wondered where he was and what he was thinking. For Gabby's family, the confirmation of Brian's confession brought a painful closure. They released a statement expressing relief that the investigation had concluded, but emphasizing that their grief was far from over. Gabby's death was tragic and senseless. The statement read, "She deserved so much more. We are forever changed by this loss, but we are determined to honor her memory by helping others." The public reaction was mixed. Many felt cheated of justice, cheated of answers, cheated of the chance to understand why. True crime communities had been following every detail for weeks, analyzing evidence, debating motives. Now, with Brian dead, there would be no dramatic arrest, no televised trial, no moment of accountability. Just a notebook with words written by a man who then walked into a swamp and shot himself. Others felt a grim sense of inevitability. Of course it ended this way. Of course Brian ran. Of course he took the coward's way out. The narrative fit a familiar pattern. Man kills woman. Man can't face the consequences. Man ends his own life. It's a story that plays out more often than people realize, though rarely with this level of public scrutiny. In the months that followed, investigators released more details about the case, though many questions remained unanswered. The FBI confirmed that Gabby and Brian had been traveling through Grand Teton National Park in late August. They had been camping at dispersed sites, moving frequently, as was their pattern throughout the trip. Based on forensic evidence and witness accounts, investigators believed that Gabby was killed on or around August 27, 2021. The exact circumstances of her death, what triggered the violence, what was said, whether there was a prolonged struggle, remained known only to Brian. The notebook confession reportedly acknowledged responsibility, but did not provide extensive detail about the events leading up to Gabby's death. Brian's writings, according to sources familiar with the investigation, framed his actions as a response to Gabby being in pain or injured, claiming he ended her life out of mercy. This account was immediately and vehemently rejected by Gabby's family, investigators, and medical experts, who pointed out that the forensic evidence did not support this narrative. Strangulation is not a merciful act. It is violent, prolonged, and intentional. The notion that Brian killed Gabby and her suffering was, to many, a final act of manipulation, an attempt to rewrite the story, to paint himself as something other than what he was. Even in death, even in his supposed confession, he was trying to control the narrative. The Petito family filed a civil lawsuit against Brian Laundrie's estate, seeking damages for Gabby's wrongful death. While no amount of money could ever compensate for their loss, the lawsuit was also about accountability, about creating a legal record of what happened, about ensuring that Brian's name would forever be associated with his crime. In addition to the civil suit against Brian's estate, the Petito family also filed a lawsuit against the Laundrie family, specifically Chris and Roberta Laundrie, alleging that they knew Gabby was dead while her family desperately searched for her, and that they intentionally withheld information and caused the Petito family emotional distress. The lawsuit pointed to actions and statements by the Laundries during the period when Gabby was missing, suggesting they had knowledge of her death and chose to remain silent. The Laundrie family, through their attorney, denied these allegations. They maintained that they had acted on the advice of counsel and had cooperated with law enforcement to the extent legally required. The legal battles would drag on, adding another layer of pain and complexity to an already devastating situation. But beyond the lawsuits, beyond the legal maneuvering, there was a broader conversation happening across the country. Gabby Petito's case had touched a nerve. It had sparked discussions about domestic violence, about the warning signs people miss, about the ways social media can both illuminate and obscure the truth. It had raised uncomfortable questions about media coverage, about which missing persons cases receive attention and which do not, about race and privilege and the phenomenon known as missing white woman syndrome. Gabby's case received unprecedented media coverage. Her face was everywhere, on television, on billboards, on social media feeds. Millions of people felt personally invested in finding her. And while that attention ultimately helped locate her body and piece together what happened, it also highlighted a stark disparity. At the same time Gabby's disappearance dominated headlines, hundreds of other people, disproportionately women of color, indigenous women, and marginalized individuals, went missing with little to no media coverage. Gabby's family acknowledged this disparity. They used their platform to bring attention to other missing persons cases, particularly those involving indigenous women and girls, who go missing at alarming rates and whose cases often receive minimal resources and attention. The Gabby Petito Foundation pledged to support families of all missing persons, regardless of race or background, recognizing that Gabby's privilege had played a role in the attention her case received. The broader cultural impact of the case was undeniable. The phrase van life took on a darker connotation. The idyllic images of couples traveling the country in converted vans were now tinged with the knowledge of what can happen when relationships turn toxic and isolation becomes dangerous. Influencers who documented their own van life journeys faced uncomfortable questions about the realities behind the curated photos and cheerful captions. The Moab police stop became a teaching moment in law enforcement training programs across the country. Domestic violence experts analyzed the footage, pointing out the red flags, the dynamics at play, the ways officers could have responded differently. The incident sparked policy discussions about how police should handle domestic disputes, about the importance of understanding coercive control and psychological abuse, about the need for specialized training for young women in relationships. Gabby's story became a cautionary tale and a rallying cry. Social media was flooded with posts from women sharing their healthy relationships, of warning signs they ignored, of times they blamed themselves for their partner's behavior. Gabby's death gave many people the courage to leave dangerous situations, to recognize that love shouldn't hurt, that anxiety and fear are not normal components of a healthy relationship. The case also reignited debates about privacy, social media, and the ethics of online sleuthing. Millions of people had followed the case in real time, analyzing Gabby's Instagram posts, watching the body camera footage, tracking down leads, and sharing theories. Some of this crowdsourced investigation had been helpful. The TikTok user who found footage of the van, the witnesses who came forward after seeing media coverage. But much of it veered into invasive territory, with people harassing the Laundrie family, doxing anyone tangentially connected to the case, and spreading misinformation. The intensity of the online obsession with the case raised questions about our collective relationship with true crime. Why are we so drawn to these stories? What do we hope to gain from dissecting the intimate details of someone else's tragedy? Is our fascination helping or hurting? These questions didn't have easy answers, but they were worth asking. As 2021 drew to a close, the physical investigation into Gabby Petito's death was complete. Brian Laundrie was dead, the notebook confession had been examined, the evidence had been processed. The timeline had been established. But the emotional investigation, the reckoning with what this case meant, what it revealed about society, about relationships, about the ways we fail to protect vulnerable people, was ongoing. In the aftermath of Brian Laundrie's death and the closure of the criminal investigation, attention turned to understanding the fuller picture of who Gabby Petito had been and what her relationship with Brian had truly looked like beneath the surface. The Instagram posts and YouTube videos showed one version of their story: sunlit adventures, smiling faces, the romance of the open road. But friends, family members, and people who had known the couple began sharing glimpses of a far more complicated reality. Rose Davis, one of Gabby's closest friends, gave several interviews in the months following Gabby's death. Rose had known Gabby for years, and she had watched the relationship with Brian develop and evolve. According to Rose, the relationship had not always been troubled. In the beginning, Brian had seemed sweet, attentive, someone who made Gabby happy. But over time, Rose noticed changes. Gabby became more withdrawn. She was less available to her friends. When they did talk, Gabby seemed anxious, constantly worried about whether Brian was upset with her. Rose described incidents where Brian would take Gabby's ID so she couldn't go out with friends, where he would hide her phone, where he would belittle her dreams of becoming an influencer and tell her she wasn't good enough. These behaviors, controlling, isolating, undermining, are classic hallmarks of emotional abuse. But like many people in abusive relationships, Gabby minimized these incidents when Rose confronted her about them. She would make excuses for Brian. She would say he was just stressed, just protective, just worried about her safety. Rose also revealed that Gabby had expressed doubts about the cross-country trip before they left. She was excited about the adventure, but she was also nervous about spending so much time alone with Brian in such close quarters. She worried that the stress of the trip might make things worse between them. But she also felt committed to the relationship, invested in making it work, hopeful that getting away from everyday pressures might actually bring them closer together. This hope, that things would get better, that the relationship could be saved, that the person you love would change, is something countless abuse survivors recognize. It's not weakness or stupidity. It's the human capacity for optimism, for forgiveness, for believing in the best in people we care about. But sometimes that hope is dangerous. Sometimes it keeps people in situations that escalate until it's too late. Another friend, Ben Matula, who had known both Gabby and Brian, described Brian as jealous and possessive. According to Ben, Brian would become visibly uncomfortable when other men talked to Gabby. He would insert himself into conversations, physically position himself between Gabby and other people, make pointed comments designed to remind everyone that Gabby was his girlfriend. Ben described these behaviors as controlling, though he admitted that at the time, he hadn't fully recognized how serious they were. These accounts painted a picture of a relationship marked by increasing control and psychological manipulation. But importantly, none of Gabby's friends reported witnessing physical violence before the trip. The abuse seemed to be primarily emotional and psychological, the kind that leaves no visible bruises but erodes a person's sense of self, their confidence, their ability to recognize danger. Gabby's family also began speaking more openly about what they had observed. Gabby's mother, Nicole, admitted that she had sensed something was wrong in the relationship, but hadn't known how serious it was. She noticed that Gabby seemed to need Brian's approval for everything, that she would check in with him constantly, that she seemed anxious when they were apart. Nicole had tried to talk to Gabby about whether she was happy, whether Brian treated her well, but Gabby had insisted everything was fine. This is one of the cruelest aspects of abusive relationships. They often hide in plain sight. The people who love the victim can sense that something is off, but without concrete evidence, without the victim acknowledging the abuse, it's difficult to intervene. And abusers are skilled at presenting a different face to the outside world. To Gabby's family, Brian had seemed quiet but polite. He came to family dinners. He helped with household chores. He seemed devoted to Gabby. They had welcomed him into their home, into their lives, never imagining what he was capable of. The question that haunted everyone, friends, family, investigators, and the millions of people who followed the case, was what exactly happened in those final days. The timeline could be pieced together from witness accounts, cell phone data, and forensic evidence, but the emotional truth of those moments remained elusive. Based on the investigation, authorities determined that Gabby and Brian had been camping in the Spread Creek, dispersed camping area in Grand Teton National Park in late August. Dispersed camping areas are primitive sites with no facilities, no designated campsites, just pull-offs where travelers can park and set up camp away from established campgrounds. These areas offer privacy and solitude, which can be appealing to people seeking to escape crowds. But that same isolation can also be dangerous. On August 27, 2021, a witness reported seeing a man and woman matching Gabby and Brian's description arguing intensely near Spread Creek. The witness described the man as aggressive, grabbing at the woman, raising his voice. The woman appeared distressed. The witness didn't intervene. It looked like a couple's fight, the kind of thing people uncomfortable getting involved in. By the time the witness thought to report what they'd seen, days had passed and the couple had moved on. Or so they assumed. Cell phone data showed that Gabby's phone stopped showing activity on August 27. The last known use of the phone was in the Grand Teton area. After that silence, her Instagram account posted one final photo on August 25, a picture of Gabby standing at the Monarch Wall in Ogden. Though metadata suggested she was actually in Grand Teton when the photo was posted, indicating the post was either scheduled in advance or backdated for aesthetic purposes on her feed. The strange text messages sent to Gabby's mother on August 27 and August 30 were almost certainly sent by Brian using Gabby's phone. The August 27 message, "Stan," came after Gabby was likely already dead. The August 30 message, claiming to be in Yosemite, was geographically inconsistent with their known location and seemed designed to throw off anyone trying to track their movements. On August 29, Brian appeared alone, hitchhiking near Coulter Bay, asking for a ride back towards Spread Creek. This was the encounter with Miranda Baker, the witness who later came forward. Brian's demeanor during this encounter, initially friendly, then suddenly agitated when he realized the route would take him past Spread Creek, suggested he was trying to establish some kind of alibi or simply distance himself from the area where Gabby's body lay hidden in the trees. By August 30 or 31, Brian was driving Gabby's van out of Wyoming heading east. Security footage from a hotel in Jackson, Wyoming, captured the white in the parking lot on August 30. By September 1, Brian was back in Northport, Florida, pulling into his parents' driveway. He was alone. The van was there, but Gabby was not. What happened inside that van in those final hours? What was said between them? What triggered the violence that ended with Brian's hands around Gabby's throat? These questions could never be fully answered, but the notebook Brian left behind offered his version of events, a version that investigators and Gabby's family vehemently disputed. According to sources who reviewed the notebook, Brian's writing suggested that Gabby had been injured, possibly from a fall, and was in pain. He claimed that he ended her life because she was suffering, and he couldn't bear to watch her in agony. He framed his actions as an act of mercy, as the hardest decision he'd ever made, as something done out of love rather than violence. This account is deeply problematic on multiple levels. First, the forensic evidence did not support the claim that Gabby had been seriously injured in a fall or accident. The autopsy determined that she died from manual strangulation, and there were no significant injuries consistent with a fall severe enough to justify euthanasia. Second, even if Gabby had been injured, the appropriate response would have been to seek medical help, not to strangle her. The area was remote but not inaccessible. They were not stranded in the wilderness with no hope of rescue. Brian could have driven Gabby to a hospital. He could have called for help. He chose not to. Third, the notion that Brian killed Gabby out of mercy is fundamentally inconsistent with his actions afterward. If he had truly acted out of compassion in an impossible situation, why didn't he report her death? Why didn't he stay with her body? Why did he use her phone to send deceptive messages to her mother? Why did he drive her van across the country and return home without telling anyone what happened? Why did he let her family suffer for days, not knowing where she was or whether she was alive? The answer, according to investigators and domestic violence experts, is that Brian's notebook confession was a final attempt at manipulation, an effort to control the narrative even after his death, to paint himself as something other than a murderer, to avoid full accountability for what he had done. The claim of mercy killing was, in this view, a lie designed to generate sympathy or at least mitigate moral judgment. Dr. Brent Blue, the Teton County coroner, was asked in a press conference whether the forensic evidence supported Brian's claim that Gabby had been injured and acted to end her suffering. Dr. Blue was careful in his response but made it clear. The cause of death was strangulation, and the manner of death was homicide. There was no ambiguity. This was not a mercy killing. This was murder. Gabby's family responded to the notebook contents with fury and heartbreak. In a statement, They emphasized that Brian's version of events was self-serving and contradicted by the evidence. Brian's words are meaningless. The statement read, "He took our daughter from us, and no amount of justification or excuse-making will change that." Gabby did not deserve this. She deserved a future, and Brian stole that from her. The family also pointed out that Brian had weeks to come forward, to explain himself, to take responsibility. Instead, he chose to hide, to run, to lie. Even his final act, leaving a notebook that attempted to reframe the murder, was a continuation of the pattern of control and manipulation that had characterized his relationship with Gabby. For many people following the case, the notebook confession was deeply unsatisfying. There was no courtroom moment where Brian would have to face Gabby's family, no cross-examination that might reveal inconsistencies, no jury to weigh the evidence and deliver a verdict. Brian had denied everyone at closure by taking his own life. And even in death, he was still lying. The broader context of the case, the Moab police stop, the witness accounts of arguments, the emotional patterns described by friends, all suggested a relationship that had been deteriorating for some time. The isolation of the road trip, the stress of living in a van, the pressure Gabby felt to create content and maintain a perfect image on social media, the constant proximity with no escape, all of these factors likely exacerbated existing tensions. But it's important to understand that these stressors did not cause Brian to kill Gabby. Plenty of couples go on road trips. Plenty of people live in vans. Plenty of relationships experience stress without ending in violence. The decision to strangle another human being is a choice, not an inevitable response to difficult circumstances. Brian made that choice, and he made the subsequent choices to hide what he'd done, to deceive Gabby's family, and ultimately to end his own life rather than face accountability. In the months following the case's resolution, experts in domestic violence and criminal psychology offered insights into the dynamics at play. Dr. Jane Monton-Smith, a British criminologist who has studied homicides in abusive relationships, identified a pattern she calls the 8-stage homicide timeline. The stages include pre-relationship, early relationship trigger, escalation, change in thinking, planning, and homicide. Applying this framework to Gabby and Brian's relationship, one can see elements of this progression. The early relationship seemed positive. Over time, controlling behaviors emerged. The cross-country trip could be seen as an escalation phase, where the couple was isolated from their support systems and subjected to constant stress in close quarters. The arguments witnessed by others, including the Moab incident, represented visible escalations. And something in those final days in Wyoming served as the ultimate trigger that led Brian to shift from emotional abuse to lethal violence. Strangulation, as previously noted, is particularly significant in domestic violence contexts. Research shows that non-fatal strangulation is one of the strongest predictors that an abuser will go on to kill their partner. In the Moab incident, there was no evidence that Brian had strangled Gabby at that point, but the overall pattern of conflict and Gabby's distress fit within the broader context of an abusive relationship. One of the most painful aspects of the case is the question of whether Gabby's death could have been prevented. If the Moab police had handled the situation differently, would Gabby still be alive? If friends had intervened more forcefully, would she have left the relationship? If Gabby herself had recognized the danger she was in, would she have called for help? These questions are natural but also somewhat unfair. Hindsight is not a luxury available to people living through situations in real time. The Moab officers made decisions based on the information and training they had. Gabby's friends expressed their concerns but ultimately had to respect her autonomy. Gabby herself was doing what many abuse victims do, trying to make the relationship work, hoping things would improve, not recognizing the full extent of the danger. The reality is that leaving an abusive relationship is incredibly difficult and often dangerous. The most dangerous time for a victim is when they try to leave, or when the abuser perceives that they are losing control. Gabby was trapped in a van, thousands of miles from home, financially dependent on Brian, emotionally manipulated into believing that problems in the relationship were her fault. Even if she had wanted to leave, the practical and emotional barriers would have been immense. There were efforts made after the case to improve domestic violence response. The Moab Police Department commissioned an independent review of the August 12 incident. The review, conducted by an outside agency, concluded that the officers had made several mistakes. They had misclassified the incident, failing to recognize it as a domestic violence situation under Utah law. They had not properly investigated whether Brian had committed assault. They had separated the couple for the night, but had not taken more serious action that might have provided Gabby with resources or protection. The review made recommendations for improved training, better understanding of domestic violence dynamics, and more thorough investigation protocols. Moab was not unique in these shortcomings. Police departments across the country struggle with domestic violence calls, often because officers lack adequate training, and because the dynamics of abuse can be counterintuitive and difficult to assess in a brief interaction. Other jurisdictions examine their own policies in light of the case. Some implemented mandatory strangulation assessment protocols, recognizing that any incident involving choking or neck contact should be treated as a high-risk situation. Others increased training on coercive control, helping officers understand that domestic abuse is not always about physical violence. It's about power, control, and the systematic erosion of a victim's autonomy. The Gabby Petito Foundation, established by her family, focused on providing resources to families of missing persons and supporting domestic violence prevention efforts. The foundation worked to raise awareness about warning signs of abuse, to provide financial assistance to families searching for missing loved ones, and to advocate for policy changes that might protect future victims. Gabby's stepfather, Jim Schmidt, became a vocal advocate for missing persons cases, particularly those that don't receive media attention. He spoke at events, participated in searches for other missing individuals, and used the platform that Gabby's case had created to shine light on the hundreds of people who go missing every year without headlines or hashtags. The disparity in media coverage remained a painful and important topic. The term, missing white woman syndrome, gained widespread recognition during the Gabby Petito case. It refers to the phenomenon where young, attractive, white women who go missing receive disproportionate media coverage compared to people of color, particularly Indigenous women and women of color, who go missing in far greater numbers but receive minimal attention. At the time, Gabby's face was plastered across every news outlet. The families of countless other missing persons were desperately trying to get any media coverage at all. Indigenous women, for example, go missing and are murdered at rates far exceeding their population percentage, yet their cases rarely generate national interest. The same is true for Black women, Latino women, transgender individuals, and people from marginalized communities. Some critics argued that the obsessive coverage of Gabby's case was emblematic of deeper societal biases, that certain lives are deemed more valuable, more worthy of attention, more deserving of justice than others. Gabby's family acknowledged this disparity and used their platform to amplify other cases. They repeatedly stated that all missing persons deserve the same level of resources and attention, regardless of race, gender, or background. The case also sparked conversations about the influencer culture and the performance of perfection on social media. Gabby's Instagram feed showed beautiful landscapes, romantic moments, adventure and freedom, but behind those curated images was a relationship marked by conflict and control. The disconnect between the online persona and the reality was stark and troubling. Young people, especially young women, absorbed this lesson. The comments on Gabby's final Instagram posts became a memorial and a warning. Thousands of people were about their own experiences with toxic relationships, about the pressure to present a perfect life online while struggling in private, about the importance of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. Mental health professionals weighed in on the case as well, discussing the role of anxiety, which Gabby mentioned during the Moab stop. Gabby said she had anxiety and OCD, and she clearly struggled with emotional regulation during the traffic stop. Some people suggested that Gabby's mental health issues contributed to the conflict in the relationship, but experts were quick to clarify that having anxiety does not make someone responsible for being abused. Mental health struggles do not justify or excuse violence from a partner. In fact, Abusers often exploit their partner's mental health challenges, using them as a tool of manipulation. They might convince the victim that their concerns are just anxiety, that they're overreacting, that their perception of reality can't be trusted. This gaslighting makes it even harder for victims to recognize abuse and seek help. The legal aftermath continued to unfold slowly. The civil lawsuit filed by the Petito family against the Laundrie estate sought damages for Gabby's death. The lawsuit outlined the events leading up to the murder, Brian's actions afterward, and the profound loss suffered by Gabby's family. The case was largely symbolic. Brian had limited assets, and no amount of money could compensate for Gabby's life. But it served to create a legal record of what happened and to hold Brian's estate accountable. The lawsuit against Chris and Roberta Laundrie was more contentious. The Petito family alleged that the Laundries knew Gabby was dead while her family desperately searched for her, and that they intentionally caused emotional distress by refusing to provide information. The lawsuit pointed to specific actions, including the Laundries going on a family camping trip to Fort DeSoto Park in early September, while Gabby's family was frantically trying to locate her. The Laundries, through their attorney Stephen Bertolino, denied the allegations. They argued that they had acted on legal advice, that they had no obligation to speak to Gabby's family, and that they had cooperated with law enforcement as required. The legal battle raised complex questions about moral versus legal obligations, about what parents owe to their adult children's victims, and about the limits of attorney-client privilege and constitutional rights. Public opinion on the Laundrie family was overwhelmingly negative. Many people believed that Chris and Roberta had helped Brian escape, that they had obstructed justice, that they bore moral responsibility for allowing Gabby's family to suffer. The fact that they had retained an attorney immediately and refused to speak only intensified suspicions. But from a legal standpoint, the Laundries' actions, while morally questionable to many, were within their rights. The Fifth Amendment protects individuals from self-incrimination, and that protection extends to family members who might face legal jeopardy by speaking. The Laundries' attorney had advised them to remain silent, and they followed that advice. Whether they knew the specifics of what Brian had done, and if so, when they knew it, remained subjects of speculation and legal dispute. The civil lawsuit brought new scrutiny to the Laundrie family's actions in the days after Brian returned to Florida without Gabby. Court filings and depositions would eventually reveal a timeline that deepened the mystery and intensified public anger. According to the lawsuit, the Laundries had retained attorney Stephen Bertolino on September 2, 2021, one day after Brian arrived home alone, and 9 days before Gabby was officially reported missing. This timing was significant. It suggested that the Laundries knew, or at least suspected, that something was seriously wrong well before Gabby's family began their desperate public search. Why else would they immediately hire a criminal defense attorney? The decision to lawyer up so quickly indicated an awareness that Brian was in legal jeopardy, which raised the question: what had Brian told his parents? The lawsuit alleged that Brian had informed his parents that Gabby was deceased and that he had been involved in her death. While the Laundries denied this claim, the circumstantial evidence was damning. Brian returned home on September 1. The family retained an attorney on September 2. On September 6 and 7, the entire Laundrie family, Brian, his parents, and his sister Cassie, went camping together at Fort DeSoto Park, a popular campground about 75 miles from their home. The camping trip became a focal point of suspicion and outrage. While the Petito family was desperately trying to reach Brian and the Laundries, while Gabby's mother was texting and calling with increasing panic, the Laundrie family was camping together as if nothing was wrong. Photos from the trip, later obtained by media outlets, showed Brian smiling, appearing relaxed, seemingly unburdened by the knowledge that his girlfriend's body was lying in the Wyoming wilderness and her family was frantic with worry. The camping trip raised disturbing questions. Was this a final family outing before Brian disappeared? Were the Laundries helping Brian plan his escape? Did they discuss what to do, how to handle the inevitable investigation? Whether Brian should run or turn himself in? Or was it possible, as the Laundries later claimed through their attorney, that they simply didn't know the full extent of what had happened and were trying to maintain normalcy during a confusing time. Cassie Laundrie, Brian's older sister, would later give interviews that complicated the narrative. Cassie was the only member of the Laundrie family who spoke publicly about the case, and her statements were sometimes contradictory and confusing. In one interview, Cassie said she had been at the Fort DeSoto camping trip with Brian and her parents. She said Brian seemed normal, that they had talked about typical family things, that she had no indication anything was wrong. But when asked directly if Brian had mentioned Gabby, or if she had asked where Gabby was, Cassie's answers were vague. She said she assumed Gabby was back in New York or with her family. She said it wasn't unusual for Gabby not to be at family gatherings. She maintained that she had no knowledge of what Brian had done until it became public news. Later in another interview, Cassie expressed frustration with her parents, saying they had stopped talking to her, that she felt caught in the middle, that she wanted to help Gabby's family, but didn't have information to provide. Her interviews painted a picture of a family fractured by secrets and legal strategy, where normal communication had broken down under the weight of what was happening. The public struggled to make sense of the Laundrie family's behavior. Even if one accepted that they were acting on legal advice, even if one acknowledged their constitutional right to remain silent, the moral dimensions were harder to reconcile. Gabby's parents were living through every parent's worst nightmare, not knowing if their daughter was alive or dead, and the Laundries had information, or at minimum access to Brian, who had information that could have ended that torment. Their silence felt cruel and human. On September 11th, when Gabby was officially reported missing and the case began generating significant media attention, the Laundries released a brief statement through their attorney. The Schmidt and Petito family has been asking for information on the whereabouts of their daughter, Gabby Petito. This request has been made through multiple third parties and the FBI. It is our understanding that a missing person report was filed this evening with regard to the whereabouts of Gabby Petito. On the advice of counsel, the Laundrie family is remaining in the background at this juncture and will have no further comment. The phrase, remaining in the background, struck many as tone deaf and callous. A young woman was missing, possibly in danger, and the family of the last person known to be with her was remaining in the background. The statement did nothing to quell public anger. If anything, it intensified it. On September 13, after the Moab body camera footage was released and the case exploded into a national phenomenon, the Laundries issued another statement. On behalf of the Laundrie family, it is our hope that the search for Miss Petito is successful and that Miss Petito is reunited with her family. Again, the statement was carefully worded, legally sanitized, devoid of any real emotional engagement with the situation. There was no acknowledgement of Brian's relationship with Gabby, no explanation for why he had returned without her, no offer of cooperation beyond what was legally required. To Gabby's family and the watching world, the Laundries appeared to be circling the wagons, protecting their son at all costs, regardless of the pain it caused others. But from the Laundries' perspective, or at least from their attorney's perspective, these actions made sense. If Brian had confessed to his parents that he had killed Gabby, anything they said could potentially be used against them in court. If they made statements that contradicted Brian's eventual testimony or that revealed knowledge of the crime, they could face charges of accessory after the fact or obstruction of justice. Silence, while morally complicated, was legally the safest course. The problem with this strategy was that it assumed a future in which Brian would face trial, would testify, would have the opportunity to tell his side of the story in a legal forum. But Brian had other plans. On September 14, 3 days after Gabby was reported missing, and while the search for her was intensifying in Wyoming, Brian told his parents he was going for a hike in the Calton Reserve. He took a backpack. He left the house. He never came back. According to Chris and Roberta Laundrie, they expected Brian to return that evening. When he didn't, they assumed he had decided to camp overnight, something he had done before. The Laundries did not report Brian missing immediately. They waited until September 7, 3 days later, to contact authorities. This delay, like so many of their actions, sparked outrage and suspicion. Why wait 3 days? Were they giving Brian time to get away? Were they hoping he would come back on his own? Did they know more than they were saying? When the Northport Police Department arrived at the Laundrie home on September 17 to take the missing person report, they were shocked to learn that Brian had been gone for days. The police had been trying to speak with Brian, had come to the house multiple times, and the Laundries had never mentioned that he wasn't there. In fact, police later discovered that they had been conducting surveillance on the Laundrie home, watching what they thought was Brian come and going, when in reality it was Chris Laundrie, who bore a physical resemblance to his son and drove a similar vehicle. The realization that Brian had been missing for days, while police sat outside the house watching the wrong person, was embarrassing for law enforcement and infuriating to the public. It meant Brian had had a significant head start. If he was running, he could be anywhere by now. If he was hiding in the reserve, he'd had days to prepare, to find shelter, to set up a camp. The massive search of Carlton Reserve began immediately. Helicopters flew over the dense wilderness, thermal imaging cameras searching for heat signatures. Dive teams entered the flooded areas. K-9 units tracked scents. Specialized search and rescue teams on ATVs and airboats navigated the swamps. Drones surveyed the landscape from above. It was an enormous, expensive operation involving dozens of agencies and hundreds of personnel. Day after day, the search continued. Day after day, it yielded nothing. The reserve was simply too vast, too wild, too hostile. Water levels were high from seasonal rains. Vegetation was thick. Visibility was limited. The environment was dangerous even for experienced searchers, filled with alligators, venomous snakes, and suffocating heat and humidity. The public grew increasingly frustrated. Protesters gathered outside the Laundrie home, sometimes dozens of them, holding signs, chanting, demanding answers. One man drove a billboard truck to the neighborhood, parking it in front of the house with photos of Gabby and messages accusing the Laundries of protecting a murderer. The family received death threats. Their address was published online. People sent pizzas and unwanted deliveries to their home. The harassment was relentless and, in some cases, crossed legal lines. The Northport Police Department had to maintain a presence in the neighborhood to prevent violence and keep protesters on public property. The situation was tense, volatile, a pressure cooker of grief and anger and the desperate human need for answers that weren't coming. On September 19, when Gabby's body was found in Wyoming and the case officially became a homicide investigation, the search for Brian intensified even further. The FBI took over as the lead agency. A federal arrest warrant was issued for Brian on charges of unauthorized use of a debit card. While this wasn't a murder charge, it was enough to make Brian a federal fugitive. The debit card charges stemmed from transactions made between August 30 and September 1, when Brian was driving back to Florida. According to the warrant, he had used Gabby's Capital One debit card to withdraw more than $1,000 from her account. These transactions occurred after Gabby was already dead, meaning Brian had not only killed her, but had then stolen her money to fund his escape. This detail added another layer of callousness to the case. Brian hadn't panicked and run immediately after Gabby's death. He had taken the time to use her card to access her money to fund his journey home. It was calculated, deliberate, evidence of planning rather than impulsive flight. As September turned into October, the search for Brian continued without success. The FBI pursued thousands of tips. Reported sightings came from across the country and beyond. Brian had been seen on the Appalachian Trail, in a Walmart in North Carolina, at a gas station in Alabama, on a bus to Mexico, on a boat to Cuba. Every lead was investigated. Every sighting turned out to be someone else. Internet sleuths worked overtime analyzing everything. They studied satellite imagery of the Carlton Reserve, looking for disturbances in the vegetation that might indicate a campsite. They tracked Brian's financial records, social media activity, and known associates. They developed elaborate theories about where he might have gone, how he might have escaped, who might be helping him. Some theories suggested Brian had never gone to the reserve at all, that the story was a misdirection, that he had fled immediately and was now in another country living under an assumed identity. Others believed he was dead, that he had gone into the reserve intending to commit suicide and had succeeded, his body simply undiscovered in the vast wetlands. Dog the bounty hunter, whose real name is Dwayne Chapman, inserted himself into the search with characteristic showmanship. Dog claimed to have received tips about Brian's location, claimed to be in contact with people who had information, claimed to be closing in on the fugitive. He conducted searches of Fort DeSoto Park and other areas, followed by news crews documenting his every move. Law enforcement largely ignored his involvement, and many observers dismissed it as a publicity stunt. But it added to the media circus atmosphere surrounding the case. Throughout all of this, the Laundrie family maintained their silence. They stayed in their home, curtains drawn, attorney fielding all communications. They did not join the search for their son publicly. They did not make emotional appeals for him to turn himself in. They simply waited, enduring the protests, the media attention, the public hatred. On October 7, 2021, the FBI executed a search warrant at the Laundrie home. Agents arrived early in the morning, cordoning off the street, going through the house for hours. They removed boxes of evidence, including what appeared to be electronic devices, documents, and personal items. The purpose of the search was not disclosed, but it was presumably to gather evidence related to Gabby's death, and to search for any indication of where Brian might have gone. The Laundries cooperated with the search warrant, as legally required, but did not make any public statements. Neighbors watched as agents came and went, as evidence was cataloged and removed, as the family's private life was laid bare for investigative purposes. For Gabby's family, this period was excruciating. Their daughter's body had been found. They knew she was gone. They knew she had been murdered. But they still didn't have full answers. They didn't know exactly what had happened in those final moments. They didn't know what Brian had been thinking, what he had said to Gabby, whether she had suffered. And they didn't know where Brian was or whether he would ever be held accountable. The funeral for Gabby Petito was held September 26, 2021, in Holbrook, New York. Hundreds of people attended, including family, friends, and members of the community who had never met Gabby but felt connected to her through the case. The service celebrated Gabby's life, her creativity, her kindness, her dreams. Photos displayed throughout the venue showed Gabby smiling, laughing, living. Her family spoke about the person she had been, not just the victim she had become. Outside the funeral home, people lined the streets. Some held sunflowers, Gabby's favorite flower. Others held signs expressing love and support for the family. It was a moment of collective mourning, a community coming together to honor a life lost too soon. Gabby's stepfather, Jim Schmidt, gave a eulogy that was both heartbreaking and defiant. He spoke about Gabby's light, her energy, her impact on everyone who knew her. He spoke about the senselessness of her death and the determination of her family to ensure that her story would make a difference. Gabby is already saving lives, he said, referring to the conversations about domestic violence that her case had sparked. The funeral was streamed online, allowing people around the world to participate. Thousands watched, many crying for a young woman they had never met but whose story had touched them deeply. The service ended with a request from the family: if you want to honor Gabby, be kind to one another, look out for those who might be in danger, and don't let her death be in vain. While Gabby was being laid to rest in New York, the search for Brian Laundrie continued in Florida. The contrast was stark and painful. One family was saying goodbye to their daughter, celebrating her memory, beginning the long process of grief. The other family was silent, hidden, waiting for news of a son who had vanished into the wilderness. The weeks dragged on. October brought slightly cooler weather to Florida, but the search of Carlton Reserve remained grueling and dangerous. Water levels began slightly as the rainy season waned, revealing areas that had been previously underwater. Searchers covered the same ground repeatedly, knowing that changing conditions might reveal something that had been hidden. On October 20, 2021, the break everyone had been waiting for finally came, though not in the way anyone expected. Chris and Roberta Laundrie contacted the FBI and said they wanted to search the Carlton Reserve themselves. They claimed there were specific areas within the reserve that Brian liked to visit, places he might have gone that searchers might have overlooked. The timing of this request, more than a month into the search, raised immediate suspicions. Why now? What had changed? Did the Laundries know something they hadn't shared before? Were they planning to plant evidence? Nevertheless, the FBI agreed to allow Chris Laundrie to accompany investigators into the reserve on the morning of October 20. The group focused on an area known as Mykahatchee Creek Environmental Park, which connects to the larger Carlton Reserve. This area had been previously flooded but was now accessible due to receding water levels. Chris Laundrie led investigators to a specific trail. Within a short distance from the trailhead, law enforcement spotted a white dry bag, a waterproof bag used for camping and hiking. Near the bag was a backpack. The items were partially submerged in muddy water and vegetation. Investigators approached carefully, documenting the scene. As they searched the immediate area around the bags, they made a grim discovery: human remains. The remains were skeletal, scattered, consistent with a body that had been exposed to water, heat, wildlife, and decomposition for an extended period. Based on the location and the proximity to Brian's belongings, investigators immediately suspected these were Brian Laundrie's remains. The area was immediately secured as a crime scene. The FBI called in forensic anthropologists and medical examiners. The remains and belongings were carefully collected and transported for examination. News crews, which had been camped outside the reserve for weeks, scrambled to report the development. Within hours, the story was breaking news across every major network. The Laundrie family was escorted from the scene and returned home. They did not make any public statements, but they had to know what this discovery meant. After more than a month of searching, after countless theories and reported sightings, Brian had likely been in the Carlton Reserve all along, just as his parents had said. But instead of hiding, instead of surviving, he had been dead. The immediate reaction from the public was a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that the search was over, that Brian had been found, that the uncertainty was ending. But frustration that there would be no arrest, no trial, no moment of accountability. If these remains were Brian's, he had escaped justice by taking his own life. Questions exploded across social media and news coverage. How had searchers missed this area for so long? Why had the Laundries waited until now to suggest searching this specific location? Had the remains been there all along, underwater and hidden, or had they been placed there more recently? Was this truly suicide, or was there something more suspicious at play? On October 21, 2021, the FBI confirmed through dental records that the remains were indeed those of Brian Laundrie. The confirmation came quickly within a day of the discovery, because dental records are one of the fastest methods of identifying skeletal remains when soft tissue is no longer available for visual identification or fingerprinting. With Brian's identity confirmed, the massive manhunt officially ended. The search teams were called off. The helicopters stopped flying. The news trucks began to pack up. The protesters outside the Laundrie home slowly dispersed. The spectacle was over, but the questions remained. The discovery of Brian Laundrie's remains brought an end to the physical search, but it opened new chapters of investigation, speculation, and legal maneuvering. The FBI immediately began processing the evidence found at the scene: the dry bag, the backpack, and most importantly, a notebook that had been found near Brian's body. The notebook was waterlogged, damaged by weeks of exposure to the elements, but investigators believed it might be salvageable and could potentially contain critical information. The area where Brian's remains were found was a remote section of the Mykahatchee Creek Environmental Park, a place that had been underwater for much of the time searchers had been looking for him. The receding water levels in mid-October had finally revealed the location. This explained to some extent why the remains hadn't been found earlier. The swampy environment, combined with flooding, had created conditions where a body could remain hidden even with extensive search efforts. Forensic anthropologists began the painstaking work of examining the remains. Because the body had been exposed to water, heat, humidity, and wildlife for more than a month, soft tissue had largely decomposed or been consumed by scavengers. What remained were bones, scattered across a small area, along with some personal effects and clothing. The condition of the remains would make determining an exact cause of death challenging. But investigators hoped that skeletal analysis, combined with evidence from the scene, would provide answers. The preliminary assessment suggested no obvious signs of foul play. There were no apparent fractures or trauma to the bones that would indicate violence from another person. No evidence of a struggle, no indication that Brian had been killed by someone else. This supported the theory that had been most prevalent among investigators, and the public. Brian had gone into the reserve and taken his own life. The discovery of a firearm near the remains added weight to this theory. While the FBI did not immediately confirm the presence of a gun, sources close to the investigation leaked this information to the media within days of the discovery. If Brian had shot himself, it would explain the lack of skeletal trauma visible to searchers. A gunshot wound to soft tissue areas like the head or chest might not leave obvious marks on bone, especially if the remains had been disturbed by animals and decomposition. The notebook found near Brian's body became the focus of intense interest. Despite being waterlogged and damaged, forensic document examiners believed they could recover at least some of the writing. The notebook was sent to a specialized FBI laboratory where experts use various techniques, including infrared imaging, chemical treatments, and careful drying processes, to preserve and read damaged documents. For weeks, the public waited to learn what, if anything, the notebook contained. Would Brian have written a confession, an explanation, a suicide note? Would he have expressed remorse for killing Gabby, or would he have continued to deny responsibility even in his final words? The anticipation was almost unbearable for those who had followed the case so closely. Meanwhile, investigators worked to establish a timeline of Brian's final days. Based on the condition of the remains and environmental factors, forensic experts estimated that Brian had likely died in mid to late September, possibly within days or even hours of entering the Carlton Reserve on September 14. If this timeline was accurate, it meant that Brian had been dead for most of the time, that thousands of people were searching for him, that Dog the Bounty Hunter was claiming to be closing in on him, that reported sightings were flooding in from across the country. This revelation was both tragic and frustrating. All the resources devoted to the search, all the investigative hours, all the public energy spent tracking his movements, it had been largely futile. Brian had walked into the swamp, found a secluded spot, and ended his life almost immediately. He had never fled to Mexico or the Appalachian Trail. He had never been spotted at a Walmart in North Carolina. He had been in the reserve all along, exactly where his parents had said he would be. The fact that Chris Laundrie was the one who led investigators to the specific area where the remains were found fueled conspiracy theories. Some people insisted that the Laundries must have known where Brian was the entire time, that they had waited for water levels to drop before discovering the body, that they had staged the scene to make it look like suicide, when in reality they had helped Brian escape, and this was someone else's body. These theories persisted despite the dental record confirmation, and despite the complete lack of evidence supporting them. The human need to find patterns, to construct narratives that make sense, to believe in hidden truths rather than accept uncomfortable realities, all of these psychological factors kept conspiracy theories alive long after the facts were established. The more mundane explanation was simply that Chris Laundrie knew his son's habits and favorite locations within the reserve. When water levels dropped and the area became accessible, Chris knew where to look. The fact that remains were found so quickly after he joined the search was not evidence of conspiracy, but rather evidence and familiarity with a specific person's patterns can be more effective than broad systematic searches of unfamiliar terrain. On November 23, 2021, more than a month after Brian's remains were discovered, the FBI released a statement providing closure to at least some of the lingering questions. The statement announced that the review of Brian Laundrie's notebook had been completed. According to the FBI, the notebook contained written statements by Brian in which he claimed responsibility for Gabby Petito's death. The statement read, "Logical investigative steps have been concluded in this case." The investigation did not identify any other individuals other than Brian Laundrie directly involved in the tragic death of Gabby Petito. The FBI's primary focus throughout the investigation was to bring justice to Gabby and her family. The public's role in helping us in this endeavor was invaluable as the investigation was pending, and the FBI appreciates their continued support now that the case has reached its conclusion. With this announcement, the criminal investigation officially closed. Brian Laundrie was dead. He had confessed in writing to killing Gabby. No other suspects were being sought. There would be no arrests, no trial, no criminal proceedings. The case was over from a law enforcement perspective. For Gabby's family, the FBI's announcement brought a measure of closure, but it was bittersweet at best. They finally had confirmation of what they had known in their hearts. Brian had killed their daughter, but they would never get to confront him, never get to hear him explain himself in a courtroom, never get to see him held accountable in the traditional sense of facing justice through the legal system. The family released a statement thanking the FBI and all the law enforcement agencies and volunteers who had worked on the case. "We are devastated that Brian took his own life before he could face justice for what he did to Gabby." The statement read, "But we are grateful to know the truth, and we hope that Gabby's story will continue to inspire change and help protect others from suffering the same fate." The Teton County Coroner's Office also released additional information around this time. While they did not provide explicit details of every injury, they confirmed that Gabby had been manually strangled and that the manner of death was homicide. They also indicated, based on forensic analysis, that Gabby had likely died on August 27 or 28, 2021, in the Grand Teton National Park area where her body was ultimately found. This timeline aligned with witness accounts and cell phone data. August 27 was the last day Gabby's phone showed activity. The day her mother received the suspicious text about Stan. The last time witnesses reported seeing someone matching Gabby's description in the area. It was also consistent with the state of decomposition when her body was found on September 19. The confirmation of manual strangulation reinforced what domestic violence experts had been saying throughout the case. Strangulation is not a crime of passion or a momentary loss of control. It requires sustained effort, typically several minutes of continuous pressure on the victim's neck. During that time, the perpetrator has to maintain their grip while the victim struggles, gasps for air, fights for survival. It is deliberate, intimate, and horrifyingly personal. The fact that Brian claimed responsibility in his notebook but had not turned himself in, had not sought help, had not shown any remorse through his actions, only through words written in private, underscored the nature of what he had done. He had killed Gabby, hidden her body, used her debit card, driven her van home, stayed silent while her family searched, and only when cornered had he run and taken his own life. His supposed confession, written in a notebook that only came to light after his death, felt like yet another act of control, a final attempt to shape the narrative on his own terms. The contents of the notebook were not immediately released to the public in full. The FBI cited the ongoing civil litigation and respect for both families' privacy as reasons for not disclosing everything Brian had written. But information leaked through various sources, and eventually more details emerged about what Brian had claimed in his final written words. According to sources who reviewed the notebook, Brian's writings attempted to frame Gabby's death as a mercy killing. He claimed that Gabby had been injured. Some accounts suggested he wrote that she had fallen, others that she had been hurt in an unspecified accident, and that she was in severe pain. He claimed that he could not bear to watch her suffer, that there was no way to get help in time, and that he made the agonizing decision to end her life to spare her further agony. He wrote that he loved Gabby, that ending her life was the hardest thing he had ever done, that he knew it would destroy his own life but that he couldn't let her suffer. He portrayed himself as having made a tragic choice in an impossible situation, acting out of love and compassion rather than violence and malice. This narrative was immediately and emphatically rejected by everyone who examined the facts. Forensic evidence did not support the claim that Gabby had been seriously injured in a fall or accident. Dr. Brent Blue, the Teton County coroner, had been asked specifically about this claim and had stated that the cause of death was strangulation and that there was no evidence of injuries consistent with Brian's version of events. Furthermore, even if Gabby had been injured, the location where she was found was not so remote that medical help was impossible to obtain. The Spread Creek area, while dispersed and primitive, is accessible by road. Brian could have driven Gabby to a hospital in Jackson, Wyoming, less than an hour away. He could have called for emergency medical assistance. He could have flagged down other campers or park rangers. The claim that euthanasia was the only option was absurd on its face. Gabby's family and their attorney condemned no-book claims as a final act of lies and manipulation. Brian's so-called confession is nothing more than him trying to avoid responsibility even in death. Their statement read, "He murdered our daughter, and then tried to make himself look like some kind of tragic hero. It's disgusting, and we won't allow his lies to rewrite what happened." Domestic violence advocates and forensic psychologists weighed in as well, explaining that abusers frequently attempt to justify their violence, even to themselves. They create narratives in which they are not the villain but rather a victim of circumstances, someone who was pushed too far, someone who had no choice. Brian's notebook was a textbook example of this pattern, an attempt to retain control of the narrative, to evoke sympathy to avoid being seen as a murderer. The fact that Brian had written this account and then killed himself rather than face the consequences spoke volumes. If he truly believed his actions had been justified, if he truly thought he had acted out of love and mercy, why not turn himself in and tell his story in court? Why not allow a jury to hear his explanation and make their judgment? The decision to flee and then commit suicide suggested that on some level, Brian knew his claims wouldn't hold up to scrutiny, that the truth of what he had done was indefensible. The legal aftermath of the case continued to unfold throughout late 2021 and into 2022. The Petito family's civil lawsuit against Brian Laundrie's estate moved forward, though it was largely symbolic given Brian's limited assets. The estate consisted primarily of whatever personal property Brian had owned, which was minimal. The lawsuit was less about financial compensation and more about establishing a legal record of wrongdoing and holding Brian's estate accountable in the only way still available. The more contentious civil case was the lawsuit against Chris and Roberta Laundrie. The Petito family alleged that the Laundries had known Gabby was dead while her family searched desperately for her, and that they had intentionally inflicted emotional distress by remaining silent. The lawsuit claimed that the Laundries had acted with callous disregard for the Petito family's suffering, and should be held financially liable for the pain they had caused. The legal standard for intentional infliction of emotional distress is high. The Petito family's attorneys had to prove not only that the Laundries' silence had caused distress, which was obvious, but that the Laundries' conduct had been so extreme and outrageous that it exceeded the bounds of decency tolerated in civilized society. They also had to prove that the Laundries had actually known Gabby was dead and had deliberately chosen to conceal that information. The Laundries, through their attorney Stephen Bertolino, filed motions to dismiss the lawsuit, arguing that they had no legal duty to speak to the Petito family, that their silence was protected by the Fifth Amendment and by attorney-client privilege, and that they had not acted with the intent to cause emotional distress. The legal arguments were complex, touching on constitutional rights, the limits of civil liability, and the thorny question of when silence becomes actionable wrongdoing. Depositions were taken. Documents were subpoenaed. The legal process ground forward slowly, as civil litigation tends to do. Public interest in these proceedings remained high, with court watchers analyzing every filing, every motion, every piece of evidence that became part of the public record. In the midst of the legal battles, Gabby's family continued their advocacy work. The Gabby Petito Foundation launched initiatives to support domestic violence victims and families of missing persons. They partnered with organizations working to raise awareness about the warning signs of abuse. They advocated for legislative changes that might better protect victims and hold perpetrators accountable. One of the foundation's key initiatives was supporting the Gabby Petito Act, proposed legislation that would improve communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies in different states when dealing with missing persons cases. The act aimed to address some of the jurisdictional and communication issues that had complicated Gabby's case, where her disappearance involved multiple states and required coordination between local police, state authorities, and federal agencies. The family also worked to bring attention to cases of missing Indigenous women and girls, a crisis that had been ongoing for decades, but received far less media attention than Gabby's case had. They used their platform to amplify the voices of families who had been searching for missing loved ones for years, or media coverage that Gabby's case had generated. This advocacy was both meaningful and painful. Gabby's family was transforming their grief into action, trying to create something positive from an unspeakable tragedy. But every event they attended, every speech they gave, every interview they did required them to relive their loss. The work was necessary, but it came at a tremendous emotional cost. As the one-year anniversary of Gabby's death approached in August 2022, the case remained in the public consciousness. Documentaries had been made. Books were being written. True crime podcasts had dedicated dozens of episodes to analyzing every aspect of the case. Online communities continued to discuss the details, debate the unanswered questions, and memorialize Gabby. Some of this attention was thoughtful and respectful, focused on honoring Gabby's memory and learning from the case. But some of it veered into exploitation and sensationalism, treating Gabby's death as entertainment rather than tragedy. The family had to navigate this difficult landscape, trying to maintain control over Gabby's story while knowing that once a case enters the public domain, it takes on a life of its own beyond any individual's control. The Moab Police Department, which had been heavily criticized for its handling of the August 12 domestic violence call, implemented significant changes to its policies and training. An independent review of the incident had identified multiple failures. Officers had misclassified the situation, had not properly investigated whether assault had occurred, had failed to recognize the dynamics of domestic violence at play, and had not provided Gabby with adequate resources or information about her options. In response, the department mandated extensive domestic violence training for all officers. They updated their protocols for handling domestic disputes, particularly those involving couples traveling through the area. They implemented new documentation requirements and supervision procedures to ensure that domestic violence incidents were properly classified and investigated. The changes came too late to help Gabby, but they might protect future victims who find themselves in similar situations. The broader law enforcement community also took notice. Police departments across the country used the Gabby Petito case as a training tool, showing the Moab body camera footage and discussing what should have been done differently. Domestic violence experts were brought in to train officers on recognizing coercive control, understanding trauma responses, and identifying high-risk situations even when the victim doesn't present as a typical victim. One of the key lessons emphasized in these training sessions was understanding that victims of domestic violence often protect their abusers, minimize the abuse, and even take blame for incidents. Gabby's behavior during the Moab stop crying, apologizing, insisting she was the problem was textbook victim behavior, but the officers had taken her words at face value rather than recognizing them as potential indicators of abuse. Another lesson was the significance of strangulation. Training programs now emphasize that any incident involving choking, grabbing the neck, or restricted breathing should be treated as a high-risk domestic violence situation requiring immediate intervention and follow-up. While there was no evidence that Brian had strangled Gabby during the Moab incident, the overall pattern of conflict and distress should have triggered more thorough investigation and protective measures. The case also sparked conversations in schools, colleges, and among young people about healthy relationships and recognizing warning signs of abuse. Gabby had been young, only 22 years old, and many people her age saw themselves in her story. The carefully curated Instagram posts, the dream of van life adventure, the desire to make a relationship work despite problems. These were experiences and pressures that resonated deeply with a generation raised on social media. Mental health professionals and relationship educators used Gabby's case as an entry point for difficult conversations. What does a healthy relationship look like? What are the warning signs that something is wrong? How do you know when to stay and work on problems versus when to leave? How do you help a friend who might be in danger? These discussions were uncomfortable but necessary, and Gabby's story provided a concrete example that made abstract concepts feel urgent and real. The conversation extended to social media influencer culture as well. The pressure to present a perfect life online, to accumulate followers and likes, to turn personal experiences into content. All of this had been part of Gabby and Brian's trip. The disconnect between the beautiful photos Gabby posted and the reality of their deteriorating relationship highlighted the dangers of performing happiness for an audience while suffering in private. Young influencers began posting more authentic content, acknowledging struggles and imperfections rather than maintaining a facade of perfection. Some shared their own experiences with unhealthy relationships, with anxiety and pressure, with the toll that constant content creation can take on mental health. The conversation wasn't entirely new. People had been critiquing influencer culture for years, but Gabby's case gave it new urgency and specificity. As 2022 progressed, some of the legal matters began to resolve. The civil lawsuit against Brian Laundrie's estate concluded with a settlement. The terms were not disclosed publicly, but it was understood that the estate had limited assets and that the Petito family's primary goal had been accountability rather than financial compensation. The lawsuit against Chris and Roberta Laundrie proved more complicated and contentious. The case moved through the court system slowly, with both sides filing motions, conducting discovery, and preparing for what seemed likely to be a trial. The Petitos remained determined to hold the Laundries accountable for their silence. The Laundries remained equally determined to defend their actions as legally protected and not subject to civil liability. In early 2023, there were settlement discussions, but they reportedly broke down due to disagreements over terms. The case seemed headed for trial, which would mean public testimony, evidence presented in court, and potentially new revelations about what the Laundries knew and when they knew it. Legal observers waited to see whether the case would actually go to trial or whether the parties would eventually reach a settlement to avoid the uncertainty and expense of litigation. In September 2023, approximately 2 years after Gabby Petito's death, a significant development emerged in the civil litigation between the Petito and Laundrie families. The lawsuit against Chris and Roberta Laundrie, which had been winding through the court system with bitter disputes and legal maneuvering, suddenly reached a settlement. The terms of the settlement were confidential, protected by a non-disclosure agreement that prevented either party from discussing the details publicly. Neither family made extensive public statements about the settlement. The Petito family's attorney released a brief statement indicating that the matter had been resolved to their satisfaction, and that they were grateful to move forward with their advocacy work. The Laundrie family, through Stephen Bertolino, acknowledged the settlement without providing details. The confidentiality meant that the public would never know exactly what financial arrangements had been made or what admissions, if any, had been part of the agreement. For those who had followed the case obsessively, the settlement was anticlimactic. There would be no dramatic trial, no testimony from the Laundries about what Brian had told them, no cross-examination revealing hidden truths. The legal battle simply ended with signatures on documents and money changing hands behind closed doors. But for the families themselves, the settlement likely represented something more valuable than public vindication. It represented an end to years of litigation, of depositions, of reliving trauma in legal proceedings. It allowed both families to step back from the public spotlight and attempt to rebuild their lives in whatever privacy remained available to them. The Petito family continued their work with the Gabby Petito Foundation, expanding its reach and impact. The foundation provided grants to families searching for missing loved ones, helping to fund search efforts, private investigators, and awareness campaigns. They partnered with domestic violence organizations to create educational programs for young people about recognizing unhealthy relationships and seeking help. They supported legislation aimed at improving interstate cooperation in missing persons cases and enhancing training for law enforcement officers responding to domestic violence calls. Gabby's mother, Nicole Schmidt became a powerful advocate and speaker, sharing her daughter's story at events across the country. Her presentations were raw and emotional, but they were also practical and action-oriented. She talked about the warning signs she wished she had recognized, the questions she wished she had asked, the interventions she wished she had made. She encouraged parents to have difficult conversations with their children about relationships, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong, and to provide support without judgment when someone is ready to leave a dangerous situation. Joe Petito, Gabby's father, took a different but equally important approach. He focused on supporting other families of missing persons, particularly those whose cases received little media attention. He understood first in the disparity in coverage and resources, and he used the platform that Gabby's case had created to shine light on cases that might otherwise remain invisible. He appeared at vigils and search efforts for missing Indigenous women, missing people of color, missing LGBTQ individuals, all the cases that didn't generate headlines but represented equally devastating losses for families who loved them. The foundation also established a scholarship program for young artists and creators, honoring Gabby's dreams of building a career in creative content and travel photography. The scholarships provided financial support to young people pursuing education and careers in digital media, photography, and travel journalism. It was a way of keeping Gabby's aspirations alive, of helping others achieve the dreams that had been stolen from her. As time passed, the immediate media frenzy around the case faded, but the cultural impact remained. Gabby Petito's name became shorthand for a constellation of issues: domestic violence, missing persons, social media authenticity, media bias in coverage, the challenges of recognizing abuse in real time. Her case was referenced in legislative hearings, in academic papers studying media coverage of crime, in training materials for law enforcement and social workers. The phrase, Gabby Petito effect, entered the lexicon to describe both the positive and negative consequences of intense media coverage of a missing person case. On the positive side, the attention had helped locate Gabby's body, had generated thousands of tips, had brought resources and manpower to the investigation. The coverage had also sparked important conversations about domestic violence and inspired people to leave dangerous relationships, or to help friends and family members recognize warning signs. On the negative side, the intense focus on one case highlighted the stark disparities in which victims receive attention. The cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which had been occurring at epidemic rates for decades, continued to receive a fraction of the resources and media coverage that Gabby's case had generated. Families who had been searching for missing loved ones for years watched as Gabby's case dominated every news cycle, while their own pleas for help went largely unheard. The disparity was a painful reminder of how race, class, and conventional standards of attractiveness influenced whose lives were deemed worthy of public concern. Activists and advocates worked to address this imbalance, using Gabby's case as a springboard to demand better coverage and resources for all missing persons. The phrase, missing white woman syndrome, gained broader awareness, and some media organizations began making more conscious efforts to cover cases involving victims from diverse backgrounds. Progress was slow and uneven, but the conversation had shifted in meaningful ways. The van life community also grappled with the legacy of Gabby's case. For years, the movement had been portrayed as idyllic and freeing, a rejection of conventional constraints in favor of adventure and simplicity. Gabby and Brian's journey had been part of that narrative, until it wasn't. After Gabby's death, the community had to reckon with the reality that isolation, constant proximity, and lack of external support systems can be dangerous for people in troubled relationships. Van life influencers began sharing more honest content about the challenges of the lifestyle, the stress it can create, the importance of maintaining connections with friends and family, and the need to have exit strategies if relationships become unhealthy. Some couples created check-in systems with trusted friends or family members, agreeing to make regular contact so that someone would notice if they went silent. The community became more willing to discuss mental health, relationship struggles, and the ways that the pressure to create perfect content can mask serious problems. Educational institutions incorporated the case into curricula as well. Criminal justice programs used it to teach about domestic violence dynamics, media influence on investigations, and multi-jurisdictional cooperation. Communications and media studies classes analyzed the coverage, discussing ethics, bias, and the responsibilities of journalists reporting on active cases. Psychology courses explored the relationship patterns, the trauma responses, and the ways that abuse escalates over time. For those who had known Gabby personally, her friends, extended family, former classmates, and coworkers, the public nature of her death created a complicated grief. Their private loss had become public property, discussed by millions of strangers, dissected on podcasts and documentaries, turned into content and commodified. Some found comfort in the outpouring of support, in the awareness that Gabby's story was helping others. Others found the constant attention exhausting and invasive, a barrier to processing their grief in private. Rose Davis, Gabby's close friend, gave several interviews over the years following Gabby's death. She spoke about the Gabby she had known, funny, creative, sometimes insecure, but always trying to be better, to do more, to help others. Rose talked about the guilt she carried, wondering if she could have done more to intervene, if she should have pushed harder when she noticed concerning signs in Gabby's relationship with Brian. Therapists and advocates assured her that the responsibility for Gabby's death lay solely with Brian, that friends can offer support but cannot control others' choices, that recognizing abuse from the outside is far easier than recognizing it when you're inside the relationship. The Laundrie family largely disappeared from public view after the settlement. They sold their Northport home and relocated to an undisclosed location, seeking escape from the media attention and public hostility that had consumed their lives for years. Cassie Laundrie, Brian's sister, gave no further interviews. The family's attorney, Stephen Bertolino, retired from active practice. The Laundries became ghosts, living somewhere beyond the reach of cameras and protesters, carrying whatever knowledge and guilt they possessed about their son's actions and their own choices during those terrible weeks. For Chris and Roberta Laundrie, the loss of their son was complicated by the knowledge of what he had done. They were grieving a child while simultaneously grappling with the reality that he had murdered someone they had known and welcomed into their home. The public offered them little sympathy. Most people saw them as complicit, as having chosen their son over justice, as having allowed Gabby's family to suffer unnecessarily. Whether that judgment was fair, whether the Laundries had made the choices they believed were legally necessary, whether they carried their own remorse and regret, these were questions that remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. As the third anniversary of Gabby's death approached in August 2024, her family marked the occasion with a gathering at a memorial they had established in her honor. The memorial was a quiet place, away from media attention, where people could come to remember Gabby not as a victim or a headline but as a person, a daughter, sister, friend, young woman with dreams and talents and a future that should have been. At the gathering, Gabby's family spoke about healing, about the ongoing work of grief, about the ways they carried her memory forward. They acknowledged that some questions would never be answered, that some wounds would never fully close, that August would always be a difficult month. But they also spoke about resilience, about the thousands of people who had told them that Gabby's story had saved their lives, inspired them to leave abusive relationships, encouraged them to check on friends they were worried about, prompted them to donate to organizations supporting missing persons and domestic violence victims. The numbers were impossible to quantify precisely, but the anecdotal evidence was overwhelming. Hotlines for domestic violence support reported spikes in calls after major developments in Gabby's case. Support groups saw increases in attendance. Young women posted on social media about recognizing warning signs in their own relationships after learning about Gabby's story. If even a fraction of these accounts were accurate, Gabby's death, while senseless and tragic, had indirectly saved lives and prevented other tragedies. This didn't make the loss acceptable or justified. Nothing could do that. But it provided a measure of meaning, a sense that Gabby's life and death had mattered beyond the confines of her own story. Her family found some solace in this knowledge. even as they continued to miss her every day, even as they wished desperately that she could still be here, still be creating, still be living the life she had wanted. The Gabby Petito case ultimately became one of the defining true crime stories of the 2020s, not because it was the most complex or mysterious, it wasn't, but because it captured something about the moment in which it occurred. It reflected the ways social media shapes our lives and relationships, how we perform identity for public consumption while struggling privately. It exposed the still present biases in media coverage and law enforcement response. It illustrated the tragic reality of domestic violence, how it can hide in plain sight, how victims protect abusers, how escalation can be sudden and fatal. Most importantly, it reminded people that behind every headline, every hashtag, every viral story, there are real human beings experiencing real grief. Gabby Petito was not just a case to be solved or a mystery to be dissected. She was a 22-year-old woman with hopes and fears, talents and insecurities, people who loved her and dreams she wanted to pursue. She deserved to live, she deserved better. She deserved a future. And Brian Laundrie, whatever struggles he faced, whatever explanations he might have offered, made a choice. He chose violence. He chose to take a life. He chose to run rather than accept responsibility. And then he chose to end his own life rather than face the consequences of what he had done. The world still struggles to understand this level of cruelty. This case reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight, that danger can lurk within relationships that appear normal from the outside, that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who hurt us most deeply. It's an uncomfortable truth, one that challenges our assumptions about safety and love, and the basic reliability of human connection. But the case also reminds us of our capacity for compassion, for collective action, for transforming tragedy into meaningful change. Millions of strangers cared about finding Gabby. Thousands of people donated time and resources to the search. Countless individuals have since used her story as motivation to help others, to speak up, to intervene, to create a world where fewer people suffer the fate that befell Gabby Petito. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.